Okay, so what I want to do is go through what rhetorical appeals are. Okay, rhetorical appeals are basically a way of persuading an audience. Um, Really, you could have rhetorical appeals in any kind of literary form, whether it's film or a written novel or even poetry, but most often the place where you find it is in speech or rhetoric, okay? Basically, making an argument for an audience. Rhetorical appeals come from Aristotle. Um, like many Greek philosophers, Aristotle was concerned with trying to kind of break down what humans do in their everyday life into like natural laws, right? Or at least some kind of scientific organization. So Aristotle was interested in the kind of the science behind why people listen to an argument. Um, and he came up with three specific rhetorical appeals, or in other words, like a way of appealing to your audience. Rhetoric just means the art of making an argument. So a rhetorical appeal is like a way of making your argument appeal to an audience. Okay. These three appeals were called ethos, pathos, and logos. Okay. Sometimes you hear ethos described as ethos. Sometimes you hear pathos described as pathos. It really doesn't matter. People generally have their own pronunciation and want to promote that for whatever reason. But these are the three main rhetorical appeals that we're going to look at. Okay. So, one quick thing actually. A lot of this rhetoric, it's kind of reignited with the Enlightenment. So, oftentimes, learning about rhetorical appeals gets kind of lumped into the Enlightenment because it's kind of this like attempt to be scientific about the way people actually make an argument. But rhetoric is not necessarily an Enlightenment idea, right? Rhetoric goes well with the Enlightenment. Rhetorical appeals go well with the Enlightenment, but they are not specific to the Enlightenment, right? I mean, they're Greek ideas, and we still hear rhetoric being used all the time today. So, in order to actually figure out what a rhetorical appeal is and why we need it, we need to think about how you break down persuasive writing into a couple of steps. Okay. First, what's your purpose? Then, what's your audience or who is your audience? Three, try and figure out the support of that audience, so how receptive they are to your argument. Four, deciding which appeal you should use given what the appeals are. And then you write it, so you construct your appeals in order. Okay. So, first of all, when writing, you got to figure out what your purpose is. Okay. So, very often you want the audience to do something at the end of your writing. Okay. Um, for instance, you might want a desired action. Okay. So, for example, Patrick Henry, in his famous speech, "Give me liberty or give me death," the action that he wants is a commitment to arms. He wants the United States to go to war and be ready to go to war with Great Britain. That's a pretty big desired action, to be ready to go to war. Okay. For Phyllis Wheatley, her desired purpose, right, or her action that she wanted was basically freedom from slavery. So abolish slavery. That's the action, to get rid of slavery. Stephen Crane, author of Maggie, A Girl of the Streets, he basically wants social reform. So he wants people to help the people who are in the slums. He wants social support and social reform of the kinds of environments that create Maggie. And the way that he accomplishes his persuasion is by having naturalism, right? And by having this like really specific kind of an environment in order to show what happens to people, right? So if we go back to what our purpose is, it's basically to get an action from your audience. Okay. Now, we need to know who your audience is. So if you go into this as thinking, okay, the action that I want from my audience is a call to arms. I want them to be ready to go to war with Great Britain. You have to consider who your audience is, right? So Patrick Henry had 18th century Americans. That's a ton of different people, right? Some of them are afraid, some of them are owning property, some of them are not property owners, right? They're a really diverse group of people. Patrick Henry, for instance, had really three different kinds of audiences. And when we're trying to figure out who our audience is and how supportive they are to our argument, we can generally break them down into three categories, okay? Supportive, wavering, and hostile, okay? So, supportive, right, is somebody who's willing to basically take action, right? They just need to be convinced to take action. Wavering is somebody who's willing to listen. Hostile is somebody who doesn't want to do anything that you're asking them to do, okay? So let me explain a little bit further, okay? Let's say you're trying to convince somebody who is hostile to your argument, right? You're not going to be able to convince them to do your action right away. If you have somebody who definitely does not want to go to war with Britain, the purpose that you have is not going to be necessarily to convince them to go to war with Britain. The purpose is going to be to move them to become somebody who's willing to listen. Okay? The purpose with a wavering audience is going to be move them into somebody who could be supportive. And the purpose of a supportive audience is to get them to act. So a lot of times with an audience, you have to kind of move them down the line to get them ready to act. So first, Patrick Henry really has to make his audience members wavering and then supportive, and then they'll act. Okay? It's only a supportive audience that can be moved to action. So if we go back to this idea that purpose is a desired action response, the purpose is going to change based on your audience. Okay? All right, so let's actually get a visual of this. Okay, so a hostile audience, your purpose is always to change them into a wavering audience. Okay, and you're going to need certain appeals to do this, and we'll talk about what those appeals are. But to make a hostile audience wavering, then now you have somebody who's willing to listen, but they're not really willing to take action yet, right? So with a wavering audience, you're going to now try and move them to a supportive audience. So your purpose is to make them supportive, okay? Supportive audience now, they're willing not only to listen, they've been willing to listen, they're receptive to your argument, they just need to be convinced to act, okay? So all these people generally have different ways of being convinced. So hostile audience, for instance, you might have to reason with them, or you might have to show them that you're trustworthy, okay? A wavering audience, generally they want to know logic, right? They want to actually be able to understand why they should go. But sometimes trust and emotion work too. A supportive audience, very often, they might not care about reason anymore. They just need to be motivated, okay? But it really is going to depend on the audience you have, okay? Once you get to know them. And the end result of your supportive audience is you're going to get them to act, okay? So, long story short, it's kind of an uphill battle, right? If you have a hostile audience, but within a really good speaker, within one speech, can turn a hostile audience into an audience that's willing to act. Okay? So now let's look at what the different rhetorical appeals are. So ethos is an appeal to your reader or your audience based on their trust in you. Okay? Pathos is an argument based on your audience's sense of emotion. So you're trying to get an emotional reaction from your audience. And logos is an appeal based on logic. So you're trying to get your audience to think logically. Okay? So let's start with ethos. Ethos is basically, it's trying to get them to listen to you because they trust you. So it might be giving you credentials. It might be kind of bragging about how qualified you are. It might be using things that show you're qualified. Okay? Ethos actually comes from the Greek word that means character. And so the idea is you're building character with your reader. You're trying to build trust with your reader, okay, or your audience. Okay? So this is something that it relies on building trust with your audience. Okay, you need to make yourself seem like a credible character. Okay. Logos. Logos, you're using structures that are trying to get your audience to think logically. Okay, so maybe it's facts like data and statistics and figures and all that. Maybe it's a logical argument like a syllogism. If this and this is true, then that is true, right? Sometimes it's repeating words and phrases using parallel structure. It's getting your reader or your audience to think logically, okay? So it's an appeal based on logic and reason. It's fairly easy to remember because logos goes with logic. And then pathos. Pathos is essentially trying to get them to think emotionally. So it's trying to elicit an emotional response from your reader or your audience, okay? The way to remember this is empathy or sympathy, right? Pathos is essentially coming from the Greek word that means emotion, okay? So it's a technique based on emotion. Other things you need to consider is, for instance, how intelligent your audience is. If your audience is really intelligent, you probably have to rely more on logos. If your audience is not necessarily super critical thinking kinds of audiences, you could probably rely on a lot of pathos or maybe ethos, right? You're just trying to get them to do something, right? So depending on how intelligent your audience is, depends on how much you can manipulate them. Logos is pretty hard to manipulate an audience with. Pathos is much easier to manipulate an audience with. Okay. You also need to think, how well do you know your audience? Do you trust them? Do they trust you? Do you know if they're emotional? Do you know if they're logical? What's your rapport? What's your relationship with the audience? If you don't have a good relationship, the very first thing you have to use is ethos. They have to know why they should listen to you, right? So, the next step, once you've decided what you need to accomplish, so your purpose, you've gotten to know your audience, so you know who your audience is and how supportive they are, and then you've chosen which appeals to use with your audience, okay? Then you write. And you're going to have an example from Patrick Henry's speech to the Virginia House of Burgesses, in which he famously declares, "Give me liberty or give me death." And this is a really good example of rhetorical appeals at work.